Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. So today, me and Matt, we're going to talk a lot about Marxism and his views on capitalism, because I've done this very potentially massive, a potentially painful thing to myself, where I decided to read some Marx-adjacent work and some summaries on Marx from more contemporary academics, and looking at Marxian analysis. I guess I found it profound because I saw a lot of things from their side in the way they like to argue it and word it, and I have a lot of objections. But because I've only entered the field, I'm reading secondhand stuff, and I'm just kind of laying out my argument. I don't really know how valid a lot of things I have to say are. I'm just kind of feeling it out and talking about my initial response as a person who comes from a point of view that is nothing like Marx. And if you've been listening to other episodes beyond Talking Points, you know that I'm like a voluntarist, a market anarchist, an anarchist in the libertarian sense, or more coming from the right. So we're going to dive into two different parts of what Marx kind of supposed to, I guess, statements, or they aren't direct quotes, but they're more of, I guess, summaries of a line of his thinking about economics. So the first kind of sentence we're going to argue about is capitalism is based on exploitation of labor, and what that means when Marx says it, and what are the implications of that, and so forth. And the other thing we're going to look at is the idea of capitalism contributing to the decay of the social order. So that's going to be the second kind of topic we run through and argue about. So I'm going to hand it over to Matt, and he's going to give a little bit more context to it, because I'm obviously not a scholar of Marx, and maybe he'll shed some light on it before we really delve into the weeds on what we disagree on.
That was a good introduction. Thank you for that. But I guess I should also stipulate that I am not a scholar of Marx either. There's a lot. I mean, Marx's body of work is very broad. That there's many facets to it. He wrote a lot, so we're not going to cover all of that in one podcast episode. And we might even misinterpret Marxism, or at least view Marxism in a way that many other people don't view Marxism. So take what we're saying with a grain of salt, but we're just trying to think about this based on our limited knowledge. So did you want to start with the exploitation of labor, I assume? Okay. So what Marx was trying to get at with the exploitation of labor kind of goes back to another idea he had, the labor theory of value, which basically means that something derives its economic worth from the labor that's put into it. So, cars, books, T-shirts, whatever they are, the value derives from the fact that someone had to put in the work to create that product or that good, or that maybe even that service. And then Marx looked at sort of the way that capitalists earn their money, right? So they earn their money by hiring people to do a certain job. And they keep the reason a capitalist or an employer doesn't fire somebody is if the value they make is worth their while. And so Marx would say that in order for the capitalist to make money, the capitalist needs to pay the worker less than the value of his entire labor. Otherwise, he wouldn't be making a profit. The only person that would be making a profit in that situation, I suppose, would be the employee. So that I suppose is like the beginning of where Marx saw exploitation. Marx was critical of the idea that you were not getting paid for your entire labor, that you were only getting paid for part of your labor, and the rest was going to your boss, the employer, the capitalist. He thought in some sense that what is most, or one of the most invaluable things in human life is one's labor, and that the capitalist takes away that value in some sense. At least it takes away the value from the worker and gives the value to the capitalist. So, and I think I've mentioned this before, of course, but capitalism is about maximizing profit. That's really the best way I've thought of to think about capitalism, because in some sense anyone can make a profit, but the question is, can you make enough profit, or can you make more profit than your competitors to stay in business? Because if your competitors are making more money than you, you probably can't compete. That is probably not a sustainable business model. And so that's another aspect of this exploitation, in a sense. I mean, it is, although it also just bleeds into the social decay part, which we won't get to at this moment. But when an individual is trying to maximize profit, they are often going to do things that might not be good for their employees, but are going to be good for their bank accounts. Does that sound like a good? That's probably a good jumping off point. So I'll let you jump in here.
Yeah. So I think there's a few pieces of his whole view on labor and exploitation that have to be, I guess, unpacked and disassembled almost separately. And I think profit specifically, I think, is important. But if we're specifically looking at the phrase capitalism is based on exploitation of labor, I think I'll touch on it on one point, but talking about competition between businesses is like a whole nother animal that might be a little too tangential if we're trying to stay focused today and not do a 2-hour podcast. So what I would touch on first is just the basic idea of the part that he's seeing, of the wages where exploitation is occurring. So imagine, you have a factory and you're selling a good for, a guy can make one good an hour. He's making $10 an hour. Capitalist sells it for $20 revenue. Presumably the capitalist is making some sort of profit. So you have this $20 revenue. Half of it's going to the worker. Half of it's going to the capitalist. Even if $7 of it is going to fixed costs and such, he's making $3 of profit when he was just, sitting in his office twiddling his thumbs. So he didn't do any labor, but he got more money because he didn't pay the laborer that $13 an hour, right? His share was $3 after the fixed costs and the variable costs other than labor. So, right, if there was no capitalist there, the laborer would have made $13 an hour instead of 10. So that's the exploitation, right? And to some extent, it falls under the ideas of surpluses. So it's like the idea of a producer surplus and a consumer surplus when a transaction happens. So when somebody buys something at a discount that they want, they'd be willing to pay, $3 for a box of pasta, but it was on sale for $1. So there's like a $2 hidden consumer surplus there. That's why it was such a great value. So I think those are kind of similar ideas that relate here. Now, I think part of it, of why I want to push back on Marx's connotation, is because he completely, he doesn't really even discuss the role of the capitalist and what he's doing besides taking the share money. He doesn't talk about what the capitalist is doing in the background in the sense of taking on the risk of the whole operation. So if you hire a labor for 40 hours a week at $10 an hour, and you're planning to sell the good for, $20, and then you'll make your profit, well, then all of a sudden demand dries up because a new competitor enters the market. Now you can't even sell that good for $20. You have to sell it for $15. You had $7 of fixed costs, so now you're losing $2 a unit. So that capitalist has taken on the cost of fronting the cost of fixed costs, whatever he paid for the month for supplies that month. And if that person has any kind of labor contract for any designated amount of time, he's also accepting those things. And if for some reason you don't profit because the market is constantly changing, the capitalist is usually the bearer of this responsibility, unless you live in a crony capitalist society that takes losses and then bails people out. So the capitalist is fronting all these risks, and Marx doesn't really talk about it. And that's part of the reason why I don't think it's deeply unethical that he's getting some sort of share there. Now, then the other piece I'd kind of, and there are a couple other things that the capitalist in the background's doing, because one, they usually come up with the whole scheme of things. So they have to come up with the whole supply chain. They have to come up with the product. They have to figure out what markets have profits that aren't being realized to enter it. So they have to do these things in the background before they even set it up, before they can capitalize on other people's labor. So it's not just like one day they woke up and said, I'm going to be a capitalist, and they didn't do anything. They have to do things that take on risk to put themselves in the situation to even be the capitalist. And then they have to obtain the funds somehow to do that. And that's to some extent, especially in the taking on risk aspect, you should be compensated, or else you would never take on risks and you would never employ people, because it wouldn't be profitable at all. Okay, the other part I would want to talk about is just the idea that the value of a good comes from the labor. I think that one of the reasons why a lot of Marxist thought doesn't resonate with me is because I think economics should be an actual descriptor of how people act in the world around us. And I'm not saying that because we don't live in a Marxist government. I'm saying it's because the precept of your goods being based on the labor put into them is not a way that humans act in the market when they look at goods. Because somebody can put their heart and soul into a book and write it for 20 years, but if nobody wants it, you can't sell that book for a cent because nobody wants to read that garbage, right? So if it's bad, no matter how much labor hours you put in by a seemingly competent person, you can come out with a product that is worth nothing, regardless of if that person put in thousands of hours into it. And it's because, and this is kind of why I lean towards Ludwig von Mises, the value of a good is pretty much decided by the human action of every individual in a market and how much they decide things are worth and how much they're willing to spend on things. So if Marx's labor theory of value is correct, or just the idea that the product is valued based on the labor, then that capitalist doesn't have risk because that good is always worth $20 because the labor put into it is always the same amount. But what can happen is another competitor can enter the market, drive their cost of goods down, offer an inferior product that's replaceable, and all of a sudden you don't have people who are willing to buy it at that rate because people don't care how much labor goes into it. They care about the good in of itself. And then to even make another point about labor, you can imagine a world where there are millions of people who can do something that is very laboring. And you can also imagine maybe there are 5 people in the world who could do something that is intrinsically easy to them, but impossible for everybody else. So if those 5 people can find people who need their service, even if it's easy to them, since nobody else can do it, then it's very valuable because it's very scarce. But if something is very widely distributed, like millions of people's ability to work in a factory, then people aren't going to value it highly. So it all comes down to the demand for it. And that's how you really get to the price and value of things. Now, I think a Marxist could say I'm conflating price and value, but I guess if they argued that, then I would say, well, what do you mean by value? Because if somebody writes a book and nobody wants it, then outside of that one person's personal gain from writing that book, there isn't value because nobody else wants to read it or gain from it. So I guess in like a very esoteric way, you can argue that all these things have value derived from labor, but there's no reason to think that means people want something that you could argue is like valuable. So I just don't see that connection. I don't think there's much defending that labor input to cost because it all comes down to demands of things. So you can jump in. That was a bit of a lot of economic stuff I just threw at you.
I guess I'd like to begin my reply by just underlining Marx's conceptualization or understanding of capitalism, because I think it's easy. You can make a straw man argument and say, you can summarize all of Marx and say capitalism bad, and people make those straw man arguments, and people are persuaded by those straw man arguments for historical and political reasons. But I think you know this as probably as well as I do, but a good portion of the Communist Manifesto is written in praising capitalism. It's written talking about how better capitalism is over feudalism, how better capitalism is over a slave society, how much better capitalism is over primitive hunter-gatherer societies. So Marx wasn't sitting there saying capitalism bad. I mean, his argument was far more nuanced than that. And I would also even say that Marx was not. I think he understood the capitalist's role, or the capitalist role in society more than you would suggest, because he was, he wasn't demonizing them, but because of all the good stuff that capitalism has led to. But he was also not. I don't think he was not acknowledging the risks, or the struggles, or the difficulties, or the labor that the capitalist puts into it. I think his emphasis is on the laborer, or is on the worker under the capitalist. Simply, I suppose, because the worker often has not had many rights or much opportunity throughout human history. But again, I just don't see Marx saying that capitalists don't have struggles, or capitalists don't take risks, or capitalists aren't putting in any labor. If someone opens a factory, as you say, they need to obtain funds. There's a risk involved, and then of course they have to hire a bunch of people to run the factory. And of course nowadays you have to go through all these government regulations, which wasn't always true. At least wasn't true in Marx's time. But now there's a bunch of regulations you have to go through, a bunch of paperwork you have to fill out, health inspections, etc. And Marx is not saying that the capitalist has created no value. I think what he's saying is, once the capitalist has put a lot of his labor into his enterprise, and then he starts hiring people, he is taking some of the profits from the employees and taking them for himself. So I think that's just a distinction to make. It's more about the fact that the worker is being deprived of a certain amount of his wages, that Marx is quite is perturbed by, and I'm not sure how deeply into the labor theory of value we want to get into, because I mean, here's kind of the way that I view economics, and I think we do disagree about this. Well, no, this is important, I think.
I was going to say we can come back to that then, because you said a lot about his view of like a capitalist, and I thought maybe we can loop back to the labor theory of value. I think we'll have time.
Okay.
I just don't want to lose the thought, and I don't want us to be like, saying like 4 minutes of stuff back and forth. Okay, so I guess what I'm pushing back on is the huge negative connotation of the word exploit, given that we know the inputs that a capitalist puts in. We know it's not easy, or else everybody would do it instead of being a laborer. And the way he then gets compensated after putting in all this upfront work is he's created a system where if it is profitable, which we don't know it's a given most of the time, and a lot of things are not profitable, a lot of ventures fail, then he reaps the rewards of setting up a system that produces goods for people at a reasonable value. So the capitalists almost set up a system for them to get residuals after they put in a ton of upfront work. So it's odd to me that given the capitalist, initiates everything and takes the risk, Marx works from the premise that since there is any profit, all of it should go to the laborer. And since the capitalist gets some of it, then that's being stolen from the laborer, and that's where the exploitation happens. And I just don't understand why the starting given point should be the laborer gets all the profit from the making of a widget, when there was so much more before it even gets to the widget and the laborer. There's all this stuff that the capitalist has to set up, and the things he's doing aren't literally profitable because he's not the ones making the literal good. They have to do all this background work. So of course, the company makes money from selling stuff. So why would the laborer themselves, who's the last step of it, be the one who makes the money there? And these people who are more in the back, like they put themselves at risk. So they should be entitled to that share. They are like exploiting from the laborer, or else nobody would ever start any venture. If they didn't, then you couldn't have a market system, which is fair for somebody to say, and that opens up a whole new can of worms. But that's the incentive in the market system, and I think I don't see why that's unreasonable. If you take the risk, you front the costs, then you're entitled to a small portion of this, and that should go without saying. I don't see how that starts as an injustice. Now, like I understand if critiques of feudalism are different and slavery, but I don't see how those are comparable to this. That's where I push back. So I don't disagree with your analysis of Marx probably understood the points I make. I just don't see how he operates from the point of obviously the laborers are entitled to all the profit from our good.
I think he would. I mean, this goes back to the labor theory of value, I suppose, in some sense, which again, I don't know when you want to tackle that or if you want to tackle that. But I mean, from his perspective, the people in the factory are in some sense what keeps the factory up and running. So again, he's not acknowledging that capitalists do nothing or don't do anything. He's not saying that. He's not saying capitalists don't have create some sort of value. What he's saying is, for a capitalist to be successful, he has to rely on other people. You can't have a capitalist on a desert island all by himself. I mean, in the sense that you're not going to be creating this big thriving enterprise on your own. You need people under you in the hierarchy. You need again, with factory workers, you need maybe janitors to clean things up. You need people working the machines. Maybe you need a couple managers above those other people. Then of course those managers are answerable to you, although technically everyone's answerable to you. So that really is Marx's issue, is for capitalism to exist. The capitalist needs other people. The capitalist needs to use other people's labor to make a profit at all. It's not possible otherwise. And I guess I'll just insert the labor theory of value, my point about that here. And this comes back to another disagreement we have on whether or not certain economic philosophies, or whether economics itself can be scientific or not. And I don't think it can be. And I think when it comes to something like value, unfortunately, it's probably a pretty subjective way to think about economics. I mean, and I think the labor theory of value has a lot of weight to it, in the sense that labor is always necessary, and you just acknowledge yourself, even capitalists perform labor. But then it gets to, are you going to emphasize that, or are you going to emphasize other parts of the transaction? Are you going to emphasize simply the whether a good or service is desired by most people or by a certain group of people. Are you going to are you going to emphasize the how would I put it? Maybe even are you going to take look at the market from the microcosm or the macrocosm? So I just don't think, and this might seem like a dodge, but I'm not going to sit here and die on the hill of the labor theory of value, in the sense that I think economics is a very unscientific, subjective field. And that's just the nature of economics. That's just the nature of social sciences. It's very hard to give exact right or wrong answers to economic problems.
Well, I think this is a whole worth exploring, because I think you have a couple you laid out a couple presuppositions that I agree with, and I just think you drew the wrong conclusion from them. So I think that actually gives us the chance to maybe make more common ground than usual. So I would say economics is a lot of subjective questions, and it can't answer a lot of subjective questions like what is the value of a bag of sunflower seeds? Because I bought one for $2 at a corner store today, but some people wouldn't buy it for $2. Some people buy it for $1. Some people buy it for $3. So what is this real value of it? But I would say economics can answer a lot of the questions, because what they do is they just aggregate data and they say, well, they've sold 10 million units of sunflower seeds from these chain of stores over the past 6 months in the United States. So that means 6 million people were able to do this. And then given the cost of the inputs, that means this is a profitable area to enter, because the price people are willing to pay is cheaper than the price that is to produce, right? So you get some idea what the value is once you can suss out how many people are willing to buy something at a given price. And a lot of it comes down to people's preferences. So obviously, like, economics as a theory can't be adaptable to your specific value hierarchy in terms of day-to-day goods, and that's fine. But what economics can be is it can be a good indicator on, if you want to serve a broad market like the greater Philadelphia area, you can figure out what kind of goods they demand more than Boston, Massachusetts. And in general, you could figure out maybe what they would price higher or lower given the different demographics preferences. So although you could say, well, then you're not saying things that are like true or factual, you haven't actually figured out the real price of something. You figured out the next best thing, which is the price you can genuinely charge to people where they'll still buy it enough for your factory to be profitable. So, like, to some extent, you're right. You're right. Like, economics is something that's kind of attempting to measure the immeasurable with the best indicators we have in human society. But I think that's still valuable. So that's why I wouldn't be dismissive of it. Now, the reason I'm so critical of implying that things have costs based on their labor, it's the same issue with thinking costs. The cost to a consumer is the same as the production costs. Because frankly, two bands could tour and go to the same stadiums, and ticket prices are going to be vastly different, because the cost isn't really the show they're putting on. It's how much people want to have a seat at that show and then competing to buy a seat at the show. And that's how goods end up as, like, in our real life, because there's a limited supply of goods. So when people look at things they want, well, there's only so much of it on the shelf. And if it's always sold out, they start making more. And if it's never sold out, they make less. And that's kind of how production ends up working. Now, the problem with saying costs for the producer leads to value is you can have people who, like, I don't want to appeal to. Well, you can easily imagine a job where bad people take people they don't like and make them drag rocks back and forth, and they're doing literal labor, but it's producing nothing. Because that's what happened in the 20th century in the most heinous regimes. But you can also imagine a dude throws $1 billion at a project, and then nobody ends up wanting it. So you hired a bunch of high-tech people and then a bunch of people to manually assemble some technological product, and now you've made a bunch of stuff that's worth nothing to anybody because nobody has a use for it. So all these people put in their labor, right? You've had people who've designed a product, but there was no buying. There was nobody who wanted it because nobody has a use for it and nobody liked it. So all the product is good for now is being dumped in the landfill or disassembled to build a new product, because nobody wanted it. It's just a bunch of wasted hours by people that created no value for society. The GDP does not really rise because nobody went out and bought the goods. Nobody valued it, even though people were paid, say, hundreds of dollars per unit to work on it. So that's why I'm hesitant to draw this association between labor and value, because anytime in the market, value ends up being derived from demand for a good versus how much of it there is. And that could be tied to labor, because if labor is really expensive for a product, then it's hard to make a profit off it. But in the end, you can make a valueless good with a lot of labor, which is like why I gave that book example earlier. So I'm hesitant to give validity to that close association that Marx wants to assign to just an abstract principle.
I guess what I find objectionable it is viewing that as the only way of economics, or maybe I shouldn't even put it like that. Viewing that as the definitive way to measure value. Again, because so many aspects of human life are so unquantifiable that I'm unwilling to say at this time that value in economics always derives from, or almost always derives from, desire. The funny thing about economics is it's all, in some ways it's tied to psychology and one's view of human nature. Now, I believe in human nature. You basically said you don't believe in the concept of human nature, but I only bring that up to say that if you have different views of human nature, you have vastly different views on economics usually. So Adam Smith was part of the Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, and generally speaking, I guess you could say a lot of Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers, they did have a fairly optimistic view of human nature, or at least a view in which human nature could be reformed. And so, Adam Smith proposed a certain kind of capitalism in the sense that he thought that since people are in some sense good, or since human nature is good, this will lead to good outcomes. But then, the Marxists might say, well, maybe human nature isn't always that good, because if you look at capitalism, it often leads to terrible outcomes. And then you have, I think you said it was the Chicago School of Economics. I always get Chicago and Austrian confused, but I'm pretty certain it's the Chicago School of Economics that assumes that people are always rational, or at least are always looking for the best thing to do. The people are always looking to maximize their the benefit they can get from certain situations in the present and into the future. And I think you made the distinction that, in your view, the Austrian school. I meant I don't remember. I meant to say the Chicago school was the one that thought humans were ultimately rational, and I think you said the Austrian school does not think that. But you also said the Austrian school does kind of think of their view of economics as scientific. So yeah, I mean, this is just I need to study more. I need to think more about it, but I am skeptical of anybody that really thinks they understand economics, or rather, I'm skeptical of people who are putting forward certain laws about economics in the same way that physicists put laws, discover laws about the universe. So I mean, if you want me to, I can try to defend the labor theory of value a little more, but I'm just kind of hammering this point home that I'm skeptical of a lot of economics. Are you hearing feedback from my microphone? I'm hearing feedback.
I think you're fine. Okay.
I'm just there's a lot of I have a lot of skepticism about economics in general, and about the ability to come to come to some semblance of truth or reality, to throw out some big words.
See, well, I guess I'll say something that's potentially triggering to you, and I guess this will wrap up this topic before we go on the next one. And then I'll say something that might be more substantive about the Chicago Austrian points you made. So the way I view economics, if you're talking about a micro setting, like a microeconomic setting in a specific business, and you have specific numbers, you can generally do things that are borderline scientific, like being in a lab, because you can figure if I do less of this input and more of this, then I'll get this response most of the time. And if you're doing it with specific numbers, you'll generally see that work, but it isn't exactly like being in a chemistry lab, but it's close. Now, when you talk about theory, I think some theories are really wrong, and I think some are they describe things we clearly see play out in the market in ways that have been demonstratable for like all of American history. And I only say American history because that's all the history I'm remotely familiar with. So it's just like that's why I lean more towards the Austrian school. I don't like saying it presumes people are rational, because the Austrian doesn't. Chicago school arguably does. Although I guess I could clarify. The Chicago school is often said that people have to behave rationally in their mindset, because the idea is any capitalist pursues maximizing capital. And then people go, well, here are times where people didn't pursue maximizing capital. Chicago school has been destroyed. And it's like, okay, well, it's the premise they assume to make their models work. And then you can obviously go, well, not everybody's literally going to act this way, but it's the general correct direction. Now, Austrian school is different, because instead of saying everybody's rational, it says everybody values everything differently. Given that everybody values everything differently, how should we proceed? And that's differently than saying everybody values things in a rational way. So Austrian economics could account for the fact that for some reason I might like really want some weird movie artifact, right? I could like really want something from an 80s movie that's worth like $50,000 to me, and it's worth nothing to anybody else. Austrian school economics could take into account that when it talks about markets, even if it's irrational for me to want it. Maybe there are times when you're talking about businesses with Chicago school economics where the model could seem a little wrong. But yeah, as a whole, I defend economics because I think it's still usable with its theories, because they're still descriptive, even if it's not as scientific as being in a chemistry lab, pouring two things on each other, and then knowing what pH it was going to be before you tested it, because you knew the ratio of two things and you knew their general acidity. And yeah, you know what I mean. Okay. So do you want to get one more word in? Okay, go for it. And then you can transition us to the next topic.
All right. I just wanted to be clear. I do think economics is useful, but it's a question of, I think my economics professor I once took used the dichotomy of quantitative versus qualitative data, or in the sense that you can't really run experiments in economics in the same way that you can run experiments in the natural sciences. And I mean, you can technically, but no one's going to do that, because that could lead to horrible human cost. And so morally, we just prevent ourselves from doing that. And so effectively, you can't run experiments in economics. But no one's saying, nor am I saying, that economics isn't useful or isn't a good field to study, or that there aren't even certain parts of economics that could be considered factual or true. But what I guess what I'm just trying to get across is I even think that the idea that we all value things differently, and therefore that we have to run our economics, or we have to think about economics through that prism, I even think that prism breaks down. And so I really think that all economic theories, they seem to all break down at some level. And so I think we need to be very careful when we are claiming that our economic theory is correct, and everyone else is crazy, just because of the complex nature of economics, and the fact that no economic theory, we haven't really even created a theory of everything in economics in that sense. And I really think there's just more to research, more to think about before I'm comfortable saying that, comfortable speaking about right or wrong answers within economics, just because I think it's so subjective. And I really just dislike when people are like, "Oh, John Maynard Keynes policies wrong, bad, factually incorrect." It's like, no, he just valued something differently than you did, so he did different economic policies. And it just seems to me that the economics is so much based on politics and philosophy that it really is hard for me to speak about economics scientifically, but we can move on. Anything you had to add to that, or?
No, I mean, there's stuff I push back on. All the listeners know that. That's fine. We save it for fodder, and that's why you guys tune in next week and the week after, and then we always have stuff to argue about, and it's great. Actually, the quick anecdote I would say is although you can't do things scientifically, some books do a good job of laying out things that are really interesting case studies, and there are reasons to think they're like about as close as you can get to like an experiment, even though you're not literally experimenting. Like when I don't want to trigger you with my example, but it's Charles Murray's book, Losing Ground, which is all about welfare policy from the 50s through 70s. You kind of get the backdrop of what certain communities were culturally, and then it says here are all the economic incentives that happen, and we directly see spikes in certain behavior because it makes a ton of sense too. And even if you can make other arguments, there is something that's like borderline scientific in the sense that it was like a beautiful case study. So I mean, I'd just say that, but that's a whole controversial thing, because we'd be talking about welfare, and we don't want to mess with that right now. So yeah, you can lead in on a decay of social order.
Alrighty. So when you first talked to me about this, I didn't quite understand what you meant. But after we talked about it a little more over text, I came to understand. So basically, Marx, as we have mentioned, he did think capitalism did a lot of good and was progressive at some level. Obviously, as everyone knows, being the founder of Marxism, he thought that capitalism needed to be overcome, superseded. Something needed to replace it. And that kind of goes back to this idea that capitalism leads to social decay. And I feel a bit more strongly, or I feel like I have a bit more strong ground to stand on in this part of the discussion than the previous part of the discussion, because I've thought about this a little more than I've thought about the labor theory of value. So capitalism, as we've said, has to do with profits. Now we can disagree somewhat about what that means and how where value comes from, but generally speaking, it's about making profits. So sometimes you can there in certain sectors of the market there can be more competitors, and other sectors there have to be fewer competitors. But generally speaking, if you're a capitalist, you're trying to make money. You're somehow, some way, and but why would that lead to social decay in that sense? I mean, as you said, the capitalists, they bring some value to society. They take all these risks. Why is that necessarily a destructive thing? And I think Marx would say, and I would probably agree with him, it's a destructive thing in the sense that, in several senses. I mean, in one way, it's unsustainable, is what Marx would say. You can't have people maximizing profit forever. Eventually, you're going to hit some wall. You're going to hit some ceiling, and at that point, the system can break down. And also, it goes back to I think Marx uses this term. I forget the exact phrasing, but something about like commodity fetishization. And that goes back, of course, to Marx's kind of view about money and people's interest and desire for money. because Marx would say that, well, there's more to life than money. Most people would. And that capitalism focuses on making money, or rather, in a capitalist system, in some sense, you have to be focused on making money, or at least you have to know someone who's willing to give you the money they made. And Marx would say that that's a fundamentally unhuman and unjust way to live. It leads to economic inequality. It leads to a misunderstanding of what is truly valuable in life. Capitalism, it takes away certain hobbies or certain leisure. It doesn't allow for leisure at some basic level. So I guess that's really where I would start with it. It's all about capitalism really doesn't allow for the maximization or allow for the maximum happiness that humans are able to attain due to its focus on a certain number of individuals making profit and the rest having to work for those individuals that are making profit.
So I like this question because it's really interesting because there's a lot of ways to take it. So like the idea that the phrase capitalism contributes to the decay of the social order, and using Marx's definition of capitalism, where it's about specifically the capitalist and not just commerce in general, I think I would do this like really annoying answer where I would say that's true, it does contribute to the decay of the social order, and then I would say something along the lines of, but all the alternative things I think of could potentially be equally, if not more, destructive. We'd have to speculate. So I'm not that satisfied that the alternative that I could come up with was actually better. And that would lean more into the ideas that are pushed by people who I guess are seen as like far leftists, where it's like where everybody has a equal outcome kind of view of things. Now the way that I think when I talk about the decay of the social order and the way we see the employer hierarchy now, I think one of the reasons why it makes people so upset and so many people, the Occupy Wall Street movement and everybody was so against this hierarchy is just because there is a perception by people who are on the bottom of the hierarchy that the hierarchy is illegitimate. I think that that's as simple as it is. So because people perceive it as an illegitimate hierarchy, they push back at it because they're the ones who are losing in the hierarchy, and they don't. So and they also happen to think it's not valid. So then it ends up coming down to, okay, I will agree that there is social decay here because people have this perception, and then it leads you to philosophical discussions like, but is their perception correct? Why is this hierarchy illegitimate? And then you get into like what you said about how Marx would say, well, these are exploitative relationships because companies are trying to maximize profit. And then I have a lot to say on profit in general. That's just like so deeply beyond, I guess, these two conversations. I don't even know if I want to get into it because that's just almost derailing. So I think it's because people perceive it as an illegitimate hierarchy, and then there's a separate debate to be have of, okay, well, whether they're right or wrong, people think it. So even if capitalism is contributed to it because of this perception, does that mean it's capitalism's fault if capitalism is legitimate? So then that really comes down to how we'd want to debate that. And we've had that debate because that's when I fall on the side of maybe voluntarism and you come on the side of, but you have to meet a certain standard. And if you don't meet this certain standard based on positive rights, it isn't legitimate. And that's where like Chomsky falls on it and stuff like that. So I'd agree to some extent. Now, I guess what I would want to talk about a little bit is the alternative to the system where, the workers own the means of production. And I'm concerned that there would still be a similar agitating relationship, but between two separate sets of workers. I don't want to say hierarchy because they'd have no legitimate power over each other. But this comes back to something we see in the world today in the eyes of, and this topic will upset you, but I'm not going to take a stance on it. I'm just going to say this is how people perceive it. people get mad that they pay money and then it goes to poor people who don't work, right? People have disdain towards people who are welfare recipients. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I really don't have that disdain. I mean, I don't think it should exist, but I don't hate the people for taking it. But there's this deep disdain, and this is what we almost talked about one episode when we had that really old Reason article where he said these welfare policies, whether you think it's right or wrong, it sets up this perception of the productive workers who are earning money get taxed, and they are very angry that they're doing all this work, and there are people who are like, and then this is the word he used, was like leeching off of their money, right? So there's this there's this problem where these two sides don't like each other and they both exist. Now, in a society where everybody ends up getting the equal outcome, I don't know if you've experienced in the workplace, but in a lot of workplaces I've been in, there are people who are very, very, very different levels of productivity in the same workspace. So if everybody gets the same equal outcome, but some people are clearly less productive, it's very frustrating towards productive workers. And this is why a lot of people who I know that are very productive that end up in a union hate being in a union, because they get brought down to what the union negotiates instead of being able to get their own raise. Because they're the productive worker and they see themselves as doing a lot of the work, but it doesn't really matter because they're not compensated for it. So I have concerns that that'd be part of it. And then you can broaden it out even more if you had a whole society that had no, employer-employee relationships. If people were given sustenance like wages, I mean, like a UBI type situation where you got a certain amount of money no matter what. If you had that money, but then you did something that wasn't productive for society at all, like nobody wanted it, then the people who are doing the hard job that nobody wants to do, but they're doing it anyways, would foster these emotions. And that's what we see in our world. And it's not because money's involved. It's just because some people are doing a lot of work and then other people reap the benefits from it. And that's something that we've watched for American history. And it's a relationship that's not good. So I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, we currently see an illegitimate hierarchy in capitalism. A lot of people perceive it that way for better or worse. But I see this productive worker, which Marx talks about the productive and the non-productive workers, but he doesn't acknowledge the tension that would exist between them if they were all the people who are all reaping the same reward. So I find that concerning.
I'm not quite sure where to take my response, or where to take this conversation from here. First off, we don't have to get into this right now, but I feel like this equality of outcome thing is kind of a straw man. And I don't know. We don't have to talk about it right now, but that kind of gets me a little annoyed when I hear people say things like that. I've used it before, so I'm just as much at fault as anyone else, but I really don't hear anyone making claims like that. But that's kind of a side point. I guess a good way to broaden this conversation out, or a good way to think about it further, has to do with what conversation we've talked about, or a topic we've talked about multiple times, and kind of maybe is the whole point of this podcast in general, is kind of what society do you want to have? What kind of society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society where basically it's everyone for themselves at some level, or at least everyone has to take care of themselves and there's no help from anyone else, or at least no help that involves coercion, or at least that's how some people would perceive it? Or do you, get certain hierarchies to help certain unfortunates just for the betterment of all? Even if that involves, in some people's view, coercion. And I think Marx would say that we should be in a society where people are, in some sense, taken at face value. So what I mean by that is a society which goes far beyond mere economic relationships. I think a lot of the issue with capitalism at some level is it does seem to prioritize the profit that the individuals make, and that in turn leads to that individual's worth. So, what's the difference between me and Bill Gates and some homeless person? And in some ways, in the eyes of our society, it's like the homeless person at some level has like the least amount of value because he's homeless. I have a little more value because I've earned some money myself, and I come from a solidly middle class family. And Bill Gates, in some sense, has the most value because he's was it a billionaire? I lose track of how much these people, a lot of these rich people, how much they are worth. But point being, it's like that. There's so much more to human life than economic transactions. There's so much more to human life than work. There's so much more to human life than the output of your labor or the output of a product you or service you create at some level. And that's really Marx's issue. Marx wants to create a world in which there's more freedom, more freedom to be yourself and to indulge in what you enjoy, and less pressure to earn a certain amount of money just to survive. That's very. Here's a funny thing, like a lot of right wingers, a lot of Republicans, they really dislike Abraham Lincoln because they think of him as like this tyrannical guy who trampled on states' rights or whatever. But I bring him up because a staple of the Republican Party in Lincoln's lifetime was this idea that first we got to get rid of chattel slavery or actual slavery, and then we got to get rid of, and this might trigger you a bit, wage slavery. Now, that term is a bit loaded. It's like, well, is that really quote unquote slavery? It's like, maybe I wouldn't use the term wage slavery, but the American, there was a tradition in America among educated workers that was not even influenced by Marxism or by any kind of European radicalism that just said, this thing we have here where people have to go to get a job or they're going to die. That is a way of life that people shouldn't have to, and that they shouldn't have to. That is like a form of life that, in some sense, is almost not worth living because you are dependent on your company, your manager, whoever, giving you money based on you doing certain things for them. That takes away a certain amount of freedom from you. And I guess I would add one more thing when it comes to this, the tension between various workers. I think Marx would say a lot of that tension comes from the way capitalism is constructed. Because going back to my little thought experiment or whatever, it's like a homeless person, me, and Bill Gates, we have so much more in common than we do different from us. Again, we're different people, so there are differences, but we share so much that we should really be working together in some sense, rather than acting as competitors for whatever money we come across. And that's a slightly silly example, since obviously I'm not competing against Bill Gates, but I think you follow what I'm trying to say. We shouldn't be focused on getting richer than our neighbor. We should be focused on living our best life, and and building some sense of community with our neighbor. So yeah, I think that sums up what I was going to say. If I have anything else to add, I'll add it after you've commented.
So there was a lot there, but the way I'm kind of thinking of it is, I think there's two ways to look at Marx. and you can look at him as a economic. Well, he's really reactionary, right? Because a lot of what he writes about is reacting to capitalism and critiquing it, which is fine. But also like a lot of what you were saying there was a cultural critique of a lot of the cultural elements that go along with capitalism, or potentially.
Can I add something really quickly?
Sure.
Okay, I just want to be clear. If by reactionary you just mean he's reacting to something,
yeah.
Because technically what reactionary means is someone who wants to turn the clock back.
Well,
so a reactionary is technically someone who wants to go back to a previous time that they think was ideal, and that they don't like, they hate modernity because it took them away. A reactionary basically would be if I was to sit here and say we should go back to feudalism. That would be reactionary.
It's like how we did an episode on populism.
Marx is not reactionary. Hold on. Marx is not reactionary in the sense that he's not asking you to turn the clock back. He's looking forward. He's looking to the future. He's not looking to the past. So I actually disagree with you. He's not a reactionary in the political sense at all.
So I would just double down on calling him a reactionary and just saying we're using different definitions. And I'm okay with you saying that. I mean reactionary in the terms of he's reacting to an ideology and then critiquing it. And that's what you hear a lot when people talk about, I guess, the right wing now, when they only react to leftists and they don't actually put anything forward, maybe. Okay, so, but a lot of what you were saying was culturally critiquing, I guess, capitalism and the way people interact in a capitalist society, when you're talking about how people feel like they need to do better than their neighbor, stuff like that. Well, when it comes down to the individual, I think that there's a lot to criticize that constantly gets conflated with capitalism, like materialism and stuff like that. And those are separate conversations on their own accord. And I really don't mind what other people do if they value material objects a lot or really do want to be ahead of their neighbor. I don't really care. That's their prerogative. And I can't stop people from feeling that way because that's how they feel. And I can't control other people's emotions. And that's one of those things that kind of bugs me about a lot of the ideas of, maybe if you make things like a worker collective, you could have everybody working together instead of against each other. But I think it dramatizes competition in capitalism by leaning into the reaction of the word competition, maybe. And then implies that everybody's like actively, hurting each other, almost like a physical competition. But in reality, what capitalism competition usually does is it usually makes life better for everybody else by driving productivity, because people want to provide a good at a lower price. So then they're the ones who get, paid for it. Because then you go to Best Buy and you see their laptop for $100 cheaper, even though it's just as good, and you buy the cheaper one. So the competition has increased productivity and has brought down the cost of goods for everybody. And that's part of what I wanted to push back to when you talked about leisure earlier and how capitalism doesn't provide time for leisure. So to one extent, I would say, well, I mean, I'm not going to do the BoomerCon thing. I'm tempted to, because if somebody isn't really versed in any of these concepts in more than a surface level, and which that unintentionally implies that we're versed in these concepts more than however much we could be for a few years of interest, because we're not 50-year-olds who worked in the field for 30 years. We're definitely not. But there are people who only know this stuff from the news or, 5 months of Ben Shapiro. And those people are less versed than us, I would say. So I could make the BoomerCon points, that are about how, capitalism has has raised the levels of life and like the quality of life in every area it's existed and blah, blah. But we're talking about Marxist capitalism. We're not talking about commerce, and all that stuff's about commerce. So that's not really important here. Now, but when you bring up talking about leisure time, my BoomerCon instinct does have me say, well, I mean, I'm not exhausted after working today. I'm going to hang out for a few hours and watch sports, and I can record a hour-long conversation with you talking about a dead person's random worldviews, right? And that's pretty cool. And we can do that. And there are a lot of people who, in our current system of commerce, are able to find ways to make money off things that are not traditional jobs. And that's exploding more so than ever now that there are so many ways to get your voice out. Like if you look at things like Upwork, where somebody can just freelance, you look at people who sell their goods on like Etsy and stuff like that. They're people who go out on all these websites and then they just start their own business pretty much out of nowhere, and they can do that and they have the freedom to do that, and it works out great. Now, one of the things, if you're talking about leisure, that kind of concerns me when we talk about a post-capitalism world, and I know that's not what Marx is suggesting because he's mostly critiquing capitalism. But when we do talk about that, it scares me because it it always reminds me how our whole economy is based on goods existing around us for us to consume. And if there are more people who are able to exercise, their freedom, right? That they're provided a base level of goods and they're not enslaved by capitalism, so they don't need to work to have their basic rights. A lot of people could essentially secede from productive jobs because a lot of productive jobs suck. I say that because I don't think I've really had a job I liked, and I've been working in random jobs for, I guess since I was 16. So I don't see why, if I had my basic needs met, why I would actually work very hard for things that aren't enjoyable or pleasurable, especially if you're living in like a post-money world, maybe even. Because then the only good of doing it is if you happen to be in the mindset of I'll do it for my community, but then you have to presume that everybody will assume your cultural norms and intuitions, and that's scary to do. Because then if it doesn't follow, then production decreases and everybody's quality of life decreases because the stuff that they want doesn't exist anymore because people aren't making it because it sucks to make it unless you can make money to buy more stuff you actually want. So I get concerned that a lot of the things that we're talking about overlook the important role that profits and wages do end up playing. Because if you don't have them, then like what is keeping me from indulging in leisure? Because I don't want to do things that aren't leisure. I do it because it subsidizes the rest of my life. Um, so what's your reaction to like that kind of thought?
So I feel a little, I don't know, maybe I'm just not explaining myself very well. I think we're talking at cross purposes to a certain extent because I don't believe that nobody has leisure in capitalism. I don't believe that capitalism has never done good or has never been beneficial to the world generally. Neither does Marx, by the way. But the issue Marx and I have is with the idea that, and this might even be a especially American thing because it's so weird in some sense. Like America is almost like especially capitalist in some sense. Like a lot of European countries, they have a bit more socialism. I mean, they still have markets. They still have privately owned businesses, but a lot of Europe, they take more time off. They have more leisure time. They have universal health care. And so, maybe I'm just speaking more about capitalism in the United States, but it seems to me that capitalism, or at least our form of capitalism in this country, puts so much emphasis on people working that it de-emphasizes people's leisure time. Again, that doesn't mean that nobody has leisure. That doesn't mean that capitalism is all destructive. But it does mean that leisure, in some sense, at least culturally, is discouraged. Because if you're taking time to read a novel, you could be working, you could be getting a couple days ahead in your work, and you're not doing that. What are you doing, you lazy bum? Stop reading a novel and get back to work. It's this idea, again, that what really matters in life is the what value each individual is putting forth, or what value the individual is generating within the market that Marx and I have a real issue with. It's there's obviously, and this isn't even a controversial thing to say, there's obviously life beyond that. You would probably even agree with me when I say that. And we want a society in which leisure is not, there is more time for leisure, in which leisure is seen as a good thing. Now, when it comes to Well, I do. Would you like me to respond to your other point, or you can jump in?
Yeah, I'll push back on that first. So see, the way I think of it is, it's like, yeah, I've totally met those people who want to work 100% of the time. They want to get stuff done, and they're like, oh, if I sat around today, it was a waste of a day. And I could sit there and I could totally waste a day, and I wish I could waste 6 more in a row, but I can't, and it sucks. But I don't think that I just think those are just different subjective values. So the fact that somebody else prizes work because that's how they derive their meaning for their life, I don't really care. I just associate with less of those people on a personal level. So it's like, that sucks. I don't adopt that personal worldview, but I don't necessarily think the world would be any better if it was more like me. I think it'd probably be worse in terms of quality of life, because if I had it my way, I wouldn't have to make stuff. Now, that'd be bad. I know you're going to address that after. But I'm okay with those people existing and having that mindset, and I don't really mind. And if that's how they derive their value, that's fine. That's like why you pick and choose who you associate with. So I get criticizing that, just like I get criticizing any other materialism or any other arbitrary signal of status, because I don't really care what people's status are. That off the record, like, I'll say things that make me sound so stupid, and I don't think that you think I'm a complete idiot, right? But I'll totally throw around vernacular that is used by very low class people because I don't care about sounding professional. That is like my lowest value. That's something that I think is so important. But when people do it, I'm like, hey, that's cool. But if you can't handle me, like, being who I am, especially if it's in a private setting, then it's like, then I just exclude them, because that's subjective evaluations and who you get along with. So I guess what I'd say is, I think your critique is fine on a personal level, but I don't think it follows that society would be better doing certain things. Or if and I also think assuming that society could adopt an ethos, if they just did, isn't like really anything that policy should ever follow from, because I don't think policy can really dictate ethos, especially in the short term. Maybe in the long term it could, but definitely not in the short term. So I just want to, I guess, throw that out there, because that's like the meta view of our meta conversation,
But I feel like, okay, so like my critique is far deeper than that, though, and I'll just say this, and then I'll jump into the other point I was going to make. Like, I'm not actually speaking about individuals who are just workaholics. What I'm talking about is the cultural view that that the people that make the most profit, or the people that are generating the most output in their field or in their job, they are the people that are the most valuable. They are the people that is the life that a human being should be leading. And I just think that is a message that we get from our culture. Maybe that's just a difference of our cultural analysis, but that's just something I hear from the culture in the United States that I think is connected to capitalism that I'm critical of. But anyway, so thank you. I appreciate you pushing back on that. It's always good. But so when it comes to, like, are people going to do anything if they don't have to, right? So it's if you don't have to make money, if you don't have to get a job, why aren't people just going to sit on the couch all day and watch Family Guy reruns and eat potato chips? Like, because what's the point of doing anything if you're not going to make a profit at some level? Or what's the benefit? Where's the benefit come from?
It's specifically, what's the benefit of doing something I don't like or derive pleasure from now that I don't get paid for it? That's specifically what I'm saying, right? Like the work I've done that's productive is not enjoyable. I do it because I get paid a salary. So if I don't get paid a salary and you're paying for my basic necessities, I don't want to do that. So I won't do it anymore. It's not that nothing matters anymore. It's now I don't have to do stuff I don't like because there's no profit motive.
Well, but Marx's point, like, and you touched on this earlier, like, Marx didn't really outline, like, what a post-capitalist society would be like. He gave some general, like, thoughts, but there's no, like, there's no one work you can say that's what post-capitalism is going to look like. That's very vague and on Marx's part. Marx's analysis of capitalism is far more grounded than his proposals of solutions or ways to go beyond capitalism. But I suppose what Marx might say to that is, in his communist utopia, or however you want to think about it, the people would have so much time to do what they want, and they would be focused on being the best carpenter they can be if they love carpentry, or writing the best novels if they want to be a novelist, or creating the best rockets if they want to be a rocket scientist. That the world, or that society would sorry, my headphones are dropping. The society would revolve around what people want to do, and so there would be less concern about having to. There would be less concern about doing bad jobs or doing unpleasurable jobs. And then I guess another thing, I think Chomsky kind of says this: when it comes to the unpleasurable jobs that do exist, they would be sort of passed around. So it's like, next week I got my annual janitorial duty I got to do for the community or whatever, or I got to work at the soup kitchen a month from now. The jobs that people don't want to do, they would be distributed in a democratic fashion, so they don't have to fall on any one person, unless, of course, somebody really loves being a janitor or being a cook or working in a soup kitchen. The point would be, I guess, to orient the hierarchy, or orient social life in such a way, social organization in such a way, to allow people to do as much of what they enjoy as possible, and then they'll pick up the rest. They'll pick up the enjoyable stuff in turn, cooperatively. And I know that's not satisfactory. That's not a satisfactory answer to ANCAPs, because why should they be? Well, one, it's like coercion. Why should they be forced to do janitorial work every other week or something, or once a month, or at a deeper level, it's like, well, still, there are going to be people out there that aren't going to want to do those jobs, and they're going to do everything they can to get out of those jobs. And what are you going to do with those lazy people? I mean, I'm kind of putting the ANCAP arguments a bit provocatively, and I guess I shouldn't be doing that, but I do think that is Marx's general. That would be Marx's general response. And just like Marx, I'm not going to sit here and say that I know what a post-capitalist society is going to be like in every detail. I would just say that I do think that there is something beyond capitalism. I don't think that capitalism is the point at which history ends, and the point at which there's no more ideological development. In this Hegelian sense of like the universe ultimately coming to know itself, or rather just that spirit, or that it'll come to a point where like everything is as good as it's going to get. Wouldn't necessarily be perfect, but just as good as it's going to get, and all you can do is maybe tweak it a bit here, tweak it a bit there, or just take it as it is. But that's like the pinnacle of existence. And I just disagree with that. I don't think capitalism is the pinnacle of existence. I'm not satisfied with it. I'm not satisfied with the externalities and the people that fall through the cracks. I don't think I'm not satisfied with that state of things. And I do think that we need to rethink the way we think about politics and economics. We don't have to. I mean, there are different ways to answer it. I mean, the Scandinavian countries, they answer it in one way, in that, or in the Europeans answer it similarly, but a little bit more like us. So, you can have like variations of capitalism, or like, it's a spectrum. You can have some capitalism, no capitalism, complete capitalism. And, I'm not going to, I think we do need to dismantle capitalism, but that's not going to happen overnight. And I think there just are a lot of questions we still have unanswered that I can't answer, that so many people desperately want answered. But that's just the nature of human history. If I had been born in the city state of Athens, and I'd been asked, okay, what is the economic and political system going to be like in the world in 2020? It would break my brain. I would not be able to answer it at all, because I would not have the ability to understand how much things could change between my time and 2020. And so, it's like, well, what's post-capitalism going to be like? It's like I'm not quite sure. I was born in a capitalist system. So I was raised by a state which is intertwined with capitalism, and the schools I went to had certain like capitalist ideas floating about them. So it's like I've been influenced by capitalism so much. It's really hard to take your mind out of the capitalist framework and think of the world as any other way. I think it was the Marxist scholar David Harvey who said he talked to someone who mentioned that they can envision the end of the world more than they can envision capitalism. And Harvey was saying, like, that's insane. Like, obviously that doesn't even make sense at some level. So that's my little 5-minute spiel. I just think, at the very least, I just want us to have I want people to have open, honest conversations about capitalism, socialism, communism, and all these different economic and political ideas. And I don't want us to take for granted the idea that capitalism is just the way it is, period, end of story.
Well, since we're doing our high level diatribes on philosophical narratives of political structures, I guess I'll give a quick 2 cents on it. I feel like this conversation really put into perspective how capitalism doesn't even have a real definition that's consistent across almost any dialogue, even in our country in 2020. Because we can read this, we can talk about Marx and we can understand the capitalist structure he's talking about, and we can see the parts of that resonate with our current system. And then you can constantly see how other people will conflate capitalism with commerce, and you can see how, well, even if there wasn't an employer-employee relationship, employees versus consumers would have certain profits because there'd be times they put in their labor and then they get paid a lot more than what you would think that their labor could justify. So then maybe you're saying, well, now the consumer is being objectified or exploited in a similar way. So I guess what I'm just getting at is there are a lot of ways of looking at the economic sphere where money changes hand that are interesting, and using words like capitalism and stuff like that, and like populism, almost just, and socialism and communism, they almost just muddle the whole conversation, because you can be talking about socialism from, like, I don't know, like a Trotskyite talking about policy versus a Leninist versus a Marxist. And to some people who are like Ben Shapiro, probably almost all is the same. Well, I actually probably would like to give Ben Shapiro more credit, but at least the discourse he talks about in the public, he would act like they're all the same, which is kind of easy to do. And it's not like anybody can learn every school of thought's nuances. So that's fair. But this is also kind of why I don't have faith in people having high-level conversations about these meta-narratives, is because why would somebody have anything to gain from talking about all these different structures in detail with their nuances? I mean, we're doing it for the sake of it being interesting, and we get to argue about it, and it's kind of fun. But I don't think there is a lot to gain from a lot of things. And it's not like the average voter really even knows that much in our already dumbed down news cycle. And it's not because the news cycle is dumbed down. It's because they only watch that dumbed down news cycle for an hour a week. So it's like, why should I expect them to carefully wager the varying degrees of capitalism in Nordic countries? It's like I shouldn't, and I have no expectation that I'd be able to do that. So I mean, but for people who are interested in this stuff, it's always fascinating. I mean, I'm planning on reading a book by Lenin in the near future, just for the sake of it. So it's always fun to further explore. But I'll pass it over to you. You can give your last thoughts on what I just said, and you can sign us off.
Alrighty. So we agree then in this sense. I mean, political ideologies or political concepts, they're not very precise. What liberalism means to one person might be different from what liberalism means to another person, and that's true of just any political ideology. There's always varying degrees of different ideas and different interpretations of the same general framework. And I guess before I sign us off, I just kind of like to do something a little more provocative. I don't know why. I guess I have caffeine in my system. That must be why. And just talk a little bit quickly in a couple sentences about anarcho-capitalism and how that relates to our general discussion about capitalism as a whole. So, like, here's the interesting thing about the history of capitalism as we know it. There has never really been completely unregulated market activity. There have always been states to manage that market activity at some level or another. Now, there were, you can, again, this isn't a precise statement in the sense that, like, I would say in some sense, a lot of these third world countries that we think about, a lot of them are doing pretty terribly, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of unfettered market activity. But on the other hand, obviously, states can do terrible things in their way they intervene with the market, and so. What interests me about anarcho-capitalism is the idea that there can be capitalism without a state at all. And it's like, even though I spoke in one episode about my ideal being a stateless democracy, like I almost have a hard time conceptualizing anarcho-capitalism just for the fact that I've never seen. Or there's never really been anarcho-capitalism put in practice, but of course, people could also say the same thing. There's never been communism put in practice. So, that's one reason that I guess I enjoy having these conversations with you. And that's kind of where, like, we part ways and where we also come together at various times on various issues. Do you want to say anything else, or should I sign us off?
I think I'll just say, well, actually, that wasn't too bad. I thought you were going to go much more edgy. I mean, I think in the end it comes down to we need to nail down definitions more, because commerce is almost a better word than capitalism, in the sense that I think it's a lot easier for me to argue that I'm in favor of commerce than capitalism. And then I can point to all the times that people have traded fairly and peacefully, and it doesn't immediately make you think of a substructure that involves, feudalism. I'm just talking about commerce.
That's why I used the term market rather than capital. But okay. I see what you mean.
But so I think a lot of the stuff that we get entangled with sometimes is precise language, even though it can be really precise, is also incredibly imprecise, because then there's like 4 ways to go down that rabbit hole. And we do have very genuine disagreements on things, and it's worth exploring though. I thought I did a decent job of keeping my philosophical groundings, I guess, separate from this discussion. I tried to give more of a reason-based argument for why I don't think it's true, and I didn't really appeal to the non-aggression principle. So I think that was my due diligence for the day. But on that note, I appreciate that you said that, and I'm glad we were able to argue about some Marxism and at least talk about something that wasn't, I guess, recent in the news, or not as broad that it leads to us yelling at each other for 2 hours. Even though that was the positive rights one was really fun. Positive negative rights episode, very fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to check us out, you can find us on any podcatcher. Just search Beyond Talking Points, or you can find us on YouTube by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points, where you can see us looking at each other unimpressed and unamused while the other person goes on a 4-minute long soliloquy, because that's pretty much what we do. And it's incredible that we don't end up yelling at each other, and we can have good faith conversations when we just give each other blank stares like, I can't believe you'd say that. I didn't mean that. But it's always fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did, and we'll follow up with you guys next week.